Okay. Look at, I didn't even comb my hair. Oh.
Now that's part of the transcript forever. That's how it's going to open with Martha Siska, Harris Award winner 2023, saying, I didn't even comb my hair. So before we get started, Martha, I have to say I was reminded, I don't know his name exactly. I'd have to look at it again. It was Yeshi Donadan or Dondon. I'm not sure how to say it, but he was the Tibetan doctor to the Dalai Lama. He has died since. But I was struck, there's a physician that wrote a story in 1987 about a time when he as a fellow watched him come into the room and do an assessment on someone's stuff. It was really telling. He goes through it, and I can send the story to anyone who's in the Washington Post. But I guess the doctor just comes in without any prior knowledge, this Tibetan monk doctor, and he takes this gal's pulse, and for 30 minutes, he just takes her pulse. He doesn't say anything to her or anything for 30 minutes. And I guess the doctor kind of describes it very eloquently, but I guess the patient's just kind of like up looking around and like would like go back down like many times. But like after a while, like it became very settling and everyone kind of settled into the room. And the doctor said something very interesting. He said, I had felt 100,000 pulses, but in that moment, I realized I had never truly felt a pulse before. And when the doctor was done, he didn't really say much of anything, but he did a couple more things. Then he left the room. And before he left, the patient just said, thank you, doctor. And she touched the spot where he had held the pulse for so long. And the doctor, just reflecting on it, was just about how his presence had just seemed more therapeutic and more indicative, even from a diagnostic standpoint, than anything else. And I say that story because I very much have learned and felt that a lot when doing cares or learning from you. I think that you too have when you approach people, you're very intentionally making sure that they're a part of your presence and that you are present with them, right? Is that fair to say?
Correct.
So I just wanted to take some time, put it on the record for whoever wants it to be a part of the record, and talk about what is it that you can bring, whether you're a nurse, you're an aide, you're a caregiver, what is it you can bring from the mind of Martha to patients when we're in these places where it's difficult to know what to say, what to do, end of life, all these sorts of things.
Yeah. Such a great story, Nate. I would like you to send me that
Yeah, I'll
story.
send that.
To me, that monk doctor, what he did was he acknowledged that he was in the presence of someone living, and that this person was far different than any other pulse he ever heard or felt, I should say. He was mindfully being present with this individual, and not just momentarily. He created the space. I like to talk about, we need to create space, we need to bring breath when we come into a patient situation. And how do we do that? Is that we come in and we are totally present. So what do I do?
Say that
Yeah.
again, that breath. What do you mean by breath? I like how you said that.
Yeah, because I don't know about you, Nate, but what I see is that, at end of life, it's like all the air gets almost sucked out of the room because we're so,
Yeah.
in families, rightfully so, they're grieving, they're wanting to do all the right thing. We have our checklist we have to do, and then we have how many more visits to do and everything, and all of a sudden the breath and the air gets pulled out of that room and out of the situation. And so I think by pausing ourselves and really, really stopping our minds, stopping the busyness of all our to-do list, and really pausing to create that space, that breath in the room, it brings everybody centered on that individual. And
Mm,
I love to hear that's a great example of what you were sharing about just holding that pulse. I'm going to remember that. That's another great visualization to people that this individual matters to me. How do I do
yeah.
it and how do I bring breath into it? Is that I learned a long time ago from the greats that you always start by greeting the individual by going to the head of the bed.
Hmm.
And that care always starts by the head of the bed. And you pause, like I always pause, that no matter if they're awake and talking or if they're unconscious, if they're actively dying, still acknowledging them by name and totally looking at that individual's face.
Hmm.
Because who we are, we recognize by a face. And
Yeah.
like that pulse, if I
Hmm.
can look at your face, Nate, and I focus
Hmm.
on you, I hear your words, I see who you are.
Right.
That's why our faces are so important. So, how I do that pulse check is that I always go to the head of the bed first,
Yeah.
acknowledging that individual by name, and taking some time, not 30 minutes, to look at their face, but
Right.
at least intentionally pausing to recognize this is a human being. This is a woman, however you see their face to be. And that then this individual had, and then I always pause reflectively to say, this individual had a full life. They were loved. Who were they in their life
Hmm.
that I need to
Yeah.
know about? This
Yeah.
was an individual. This was a human. This is not death. This isn't dying. This is about a human.
It's a moment in space and time, right? Like
Yeah,
we are having a moment with a different connection, whether that be a very deep one, doesn't have to be between a nurse and a patient, right? But regardless, it's a new meeting because their life's not over yet, you know,
correct.
right?
Yeah, and if we get distracted by all the busyness and all the symptoms and everything like that, we never connect, or excuse me, this is my feeling, is that we struggle then connecting that this is a person. It's not just a
Mm.
symptom. It's not just that quote, they're actively dying.
Yeah,
This is some individual's life that is changing. And I think that changes then all of
yeah,
our words. I think it changes how we enter into that experience to be a part of that experience with them and their
right.
family.
You ever see a movie that's a remake of the same movie? Have you ever noticed that? Like, it seems like every movie has been made at least once, right? And
Yep.
many times, like three or four times.
Yes.
But every time it's made with a little different lens, a little different purview, right? And
Mhm.
it gives a different flavor. Sometimes the technology of the day really changes it, but it's very different. And I think that's what's so fascinating about a patient story.
Yeah.
Because yes, the patient is the center of it, but there's also the friends, the family. Then there's us. And we will forever have a story in our minds of how this patient was and their death that's separate from what their family is and stuff like that. And we don't really go on sharing it either because we work within a very private way, as it should be. But it's interesting that you talk about like coming into the person and meeting this person. And it's not always uh great, right? Like sometimes
Right.
that air becomes very thick very quickly. I'm curious, do you have any times where that's ever happened in your illustrious career where things just went sour, and how do you handle that with your
Oh,
personhood?
wow. That is a great question. Yeah, I do have, I do. Yeah. You like to think that you always know the right thing to do, the right thing to say, that everyone is going to feel that you're a great nurse and that this is really a very peaceful, wonderful experience. I just had an experience just a couple weeks ago with a spouse who was really struggling emotionally with the death of her husband. And, she really became hysterical at his death.
Mm,
And, we like to think that we've done everything and we should always be just gentle and understanding and everything like that. But in that situation, is that she, was going to faint and she was going to dizzy and fall to the floor. And she just kept screaming and crying uncontrollably. And at that point in time, in that situation, what could I say? And, I did pause to reflect on that. And I think that the lesson that I have learned when you're not sure what to say, the best thing to do is be quiet. Let the energy within that situation that is going on, let that energy happen until you have come up with a thought or something that might be meaningful to say to this patient and our family. So I think the greatest thing to do is to pause and just be quiet. There was, if you read a lot, there's a lot of things in the news that are going on where people are always talking, but President Reagan's daughter, actually just wrote a book about this and wrote about, you know, different life opportunities. And she shared those exact words. She said, when in doubt what to say nothing. Be quiet and let the moment happen. And so I think too often we think we have to say the right thing. We think we have to be kind and compassionate and wonderful. But I think most importantly, the best thing to do is be quiet and then kind of pull yourself together and center your emotion on that maybe you will say the right thing. In that situation, I just very firmly said to this spouse, you need to calm down. And as she continued to perhaps ramp up a little bit more, I said, no, you need to calm yourself down. Being hysterical is not helpful to you.
How'd they respond to that?
It was interesting. She's like, I know I am hysterical. And I said, you have shared so many things that you and your husband have drawn on for your personal and spiritual strength. So I call upon you. And I do like that. I do like that phrase, calling upon people. I call upon you to go back to your faith. I call upon you to go back to your husband said he was ready to die. He was tired of suffering. I call upon you that you've been preparing for his death for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And so center your emotion on all that peace that you and your husband have shared, that he has shared with you, and draw on that strength. And I said, I'm just going to be quiet here with you. And I ask you to call upon all the things your husband has shared with you. And I just was quiet. And within, I would say, a couple minutes easily, she had quieted herself and had calmed herself where she could talk about then her husband. And it was good for her to see him finally not suffer. And that, she was getting hysterical. The other situation, and one that still bothers me, I don't know if you've ever had it, Nate. There's a patient, it was when we had GIP patients taken care of in the hospital. It was a young woman and a very large extended family that were in the hospital. So it was before COVID. And the young woman was, just terminally ill, and her body was just so stressed, and she was in so much pain and short of breath. I mean, she had multiple organ failure. And there was one son out of all of that very large group, and he would always sit in the corner. And the minute that the doctor and I would walk in the room, and it was over a period of, I think it was like 5 days. And he would stand up and he'd go right to the bed. And as we always talked to the patient first, and we sat down to talk to the whole family because they didn't want any pain medication. And it was a long story.
Sure.
And how we could treat the patient, because she would say, I'm in pain, I had pain. And we were like, do you want something to help feel more comfortable? And she'd say yes, but then the family said no. Wow. And so there was all this going on. And so to make a long story short, this son he wouldn't say anything. He always sat in the corner, and he would, in my opinion, he didn't welcome us to the situation. We would do everything we could to ask questions, ask his thoughts, what his worries were. He shared very little. So not suddenly. So when she died, they called, and of course I went to the room. And as I always enter a room in that moment where the family is grieving, just crying and very, very raw in their grief, I just slide myself in and stand in the corner until I sense that they're ready for a touch, a conversation touch.
Mm.
And as I slid into that room and they were all gathered around the bed, he again was in the corner facing the door. He saw me come in and he um, walked very quickly towards me. And I was like, oh my, he wants to, say something very
Oh,
important.
sure.
What he said is, you need to leave the room. You're not welcomed.
Wow. So what happened after that?
So I simply said, very good, I will leave. I said, I'm going to give you more time. And then I just want to say goodbye to I, all the rest of the family members and that kind of thing. So he said, you need to leave now. I said, I will, thank you. So I waited outside the door for about 15 minutes and then I
Wow.
did
A
walk back
long
in.
15 minutes.
Because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, and I wanted to just cry. I wanted to sob, like, oh my gosh, I've never had that in my life. So when I went back in, the mother of the patient came. She gave me a big hug. Two of the young daughters came and gave me a big hug. The patient's dad gave me a hug. But that son, if he could have, his looks, there was no touching him.
Hmm.
And meaning, I just said, I'm going to keep you so and so. I will keep you in my thoughts in the next days. So there was no closure to that. And when you can't
Wow.
close that emotion down, and you have no way of understanding where that emotion came from, I carry that one. I carry that one with me. I talked to the
Wow.
doc who I worked with a long time, and he said he knew he had also felt that son's emotion. And he said, I don't know what we could have done. I don't. And we talked about what was he carrying.
Hmm.
And I think, isn't that it, Nate? You have to step back. This isn't about me. This is about
Yeah.
them. And we only know a little bit of their life story. So what was he carrying within his heart and his mind? I don't know.
Yeah. I consider 4 years in hospice short still compared to many, but in my small experience, I would never underestimate the power of grief.
Yeah,
It's as
well said.
intoxicating as any alcohol or drug could be to someone. It can really turn them into a really angry person, a very sad person, a very confused person. It can do about anything. And I like how you're saying things like you find a silent place to be, to do your work, your good work, and look for good settings to share what you should and maybe what you need to, right? I mean, I heard you say like you had to tell this person you need to be calm. Like there's times when as a professional, we have to speak into this. We need to get a setting going where we're going towards a goal. But other times, wow, I can see why you carry that with you because it's also such a uh antisocial kind of an interaction
Yeah.
where here you are connecting on a very deep level with some people in the family, but one part of it is just such a sharp and serious. Like there's like a right? It's
Yeah,
hard to even
yeah.
put words to it. It's very unusual.
And I like what you said, Nate, is that I think you are saying it very well, is that, there are times where you have to move within the energy of grief, like with that spouse and
Yeah.
where her energy with grief is. And so there's times where you can move within that energy of grief. And there are times like, this son that for whatever he was carrying, and again, not personalizing it, even though
Yes.
I personalize it, I'm going to be honest.
Right.
And where you just say that, and there's
Right.
no, you can't move that there day after day, there was no moving into his energy. There was
Let's
just no
unpack
moving.
that really quickly because you just said something that I think is so helpful and important. And I know that we're still learning it, even us who have done this a while.
Oh, yeah.
But when you can swim in the energy, let's talk about that. And then we'll
Mm,
get back to when you can't, like that guy. Like there's no swimming in it. Let it
mm-mm.
be like a wild animal in many ways, right? But
Yep.
let's get back to that. But let's talk about swimming in the energy of grief
Okay.
because this is where you find Martha at her best. Like you're filling your bucket when you have someone, you're doing the good work, and all of a sudden they give you a portal into some energy, a little pool of grief to be able to help them with. I've seen you in that. You do good with this, but how do you work with that? How do you know it, and what do you do with it when it comes?
You listen for it.
Mm,
Because, sometimes, isn't it lovely if they just open up and, almost you just sort of like, oh, well, there it is. But oftentimes you have to be quiet enough just to listen
mm,
for the openings. Um, I can't tell you how many times, by just inviting, the whoever it is, the patient or the family, to tell me more about this individual. So number one, you're connecting who this individual is. They're a real person. They had a life. They loved. They were loved, etc. And then you listen for those openings in which you can really be present within their grief, whether it's the patient and or the family.
mm.
And that's, I think, when we do our best work. Our social workers certainly are our leaders, I think, in that.
Right.
But I think nurses, I think again, so how do you do that? How do you swim in that energy? And I love that, Nate. That's a great statement. I have to, before I go into a patient situation, I always have to pause at the door and just let all the checklist and all that my to-do lists go down the line, or I can't be present.
Mm,
And I certainly will not be able to hear anything that I'm supposed to hear. Oh, I'll hear about the pain. I'll hear about the shortness of breath. You can see that and that kind of thing. The more overt grief you can hear. But I think we do our best work is when we're quiet and we listen for all the quiet grief that they're trying
mm.
to tell us about, all the quiet
Amen.
holes that they want us to know about. Brent and I worked on a situation and with a patient and that kind of thing. And again, I would just go and sit with him and listen to what he had to talk about that day, talking to him about his life and that kind of thing. And there was just so many times where I kept hearing this thread of what his real need was in life. And um, he had lost contact, with his family, and he really grieved that. And you just heard the sorrow and sadness that he was not going to be able to listen to this again, Nate. He wanted to ask for forgiveness. If he
Mm,
could just say how sorry he was to them for
wow.
life, and he wanted to ask for forgiveness, that was important to him. And so I worked with Brent and we had conversations, and everybody knows great Brent and that kind of thing. So Brent reached out to his family and they came to the hospital. And I happened to be there when there was this whole very gentle, very um, healing conversation about forgiveness and love. And I went back the next day and he said, I never had heard my daughter say she loved me until last night. And so by simply hearing and
Wow.
being quiet and listening to what this patient was telling me and his life story, because I was quiet enough, I could hear what he really wanted and needed to have a peaceful end of life, and how healing that was for his family as well. And for them to say, we forgave him so long ago, we never knew, we wanted to be a part of his
Yeah.
life. So without sharing a lot more of that very special moment. I think, again, if we unload all of what we're bringing into the situation and we simply are quiet enough to ask the questions about the individual's life and what's going on with them, then we hear the real holes where we can enter in, swim in the grief
Mhm.
with them.
Right.
Yeah.
And then with the others, where the water is dried up, it's more of a desert of grief. It really is just trying to find the shade, isn't it? Those
Oh, yeah.
moments, you exist in the moments of shade you can. You provide that quiet. I mean, I've had patients like that where I remember a guy living in his apartment and it was just him. He could barely get himself to his bed. I ended up doing his dishes for him, which wasn't on the care plan, but I did it. You know what I mean?
Wasn't on the
Because it was
checklist.
like, right, it wasn't on the checklist. It was one of those just figuring it out as we went kind of situations. But he did not like me very much, but I was all he had. And I did my stuff. We never had any awesome go get 'em buddy moments, and that's okay. That's not what he needed from me, I don't think, right? Because sometimes
Yeah.
we are what the people in their grief process need, and maybe it's not the person that gets to swim with them, but it's someone that maybe is a stepping stool where some of that anger comes out. Not that it's ever right for someone to be mean towards us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But for them to not let you into their energy is okay. And
Yeah,
I think we need to respect that.
I
And that
like that.
hurts us as nurses. I'm certainly felt hurt by that. I,
Yeah.
I truly am very transparent. I was hurt by that. I was like, well, what do you mean? I'm kind of wonderful here? And then not to be allowed in was hurtful. But then I've prayed about it, I've reflected about it. I think about that situation still, and that was before COVID, so that was over 3 years ago.
Mm,
And what was I to learn from that situation? And how can I put that into realistic perspective that I don't take into another situation? And really it falls back on respecting that young man's perspective and where he was in grief, and allowing him and respecting him, that for whatever reason he had to stay, I'm going to say, in that box. He couldn't let a lot of energy in or out of that box for whatever reason. He was the
right,
eldest son. um, the family unit definitely functioned at a certain way, and I have to really respect that and not carry that with me to another situation, and not let it allow me to think of that young man in a negative way as well.
right,
Like you said, grief comes and people deal with grief in a whole different way. Our role is to respect that, listen for those openings in which we can enter into and perhaps heal them, but also respect that when that energy, we're
right.
not invited. And really, I like that word, Nate. I like to say we are invited into this time in people's life.
Hmm. Well, getting back to something you said much earlier is that because you like to invite them, you like
Yeah.
to invite them to become this person as a
Yep.
caregiver, right? What you
Yep.
said a certain word. You said you don't give them commands per se, but what did you say? You said you
Uh, I don't know
oh,
what I
you don't
said.
even remember.
No,
Okay.
I
But
was just
you
talking.
basically command them. Which I think sometimes people that are really
Oh, I
hysterical
call upon them.
call upon them. I knew it was
Right?
something very
Yeah.
grand. But
Because
yes,
isn't that you call upon them, you invite them, they invite
yes,
us. That we just didn't come in, so we have to present ourselves like this was an invitation. And when you're invited in, I think that changes your whole mindset. I think that changes your spirit and the energy you bring into the situation. So they might not have invited us in for everything, and you have to be very mindful of that. Is that, again, how many times, Nate, have you and I both been in a situation where you just can't understand this family? They're not following anything you're saying. That their loved one is in pain. We can see, we would like to make them more comfortable. They're not interested in it.
Mm.
Remember, the invitation was not for us to come and take over.
Yeah.
We were just invited to the table to be
Mm.
present with them. And so
like
again, if you look at an invitation, and then many times in those hard situations, like, again, Nate, I bet you can share just as many examples. I was caring for a individual in a nursing home and working with it, and she was terribly cachectic. The staff was trying to feed her, she wouldn't eat and that kind of thing. But the husband would come, and then, and he told me he was pushing his head back and pouring the Ensure down and that kind of thing. And his goal was to get 3 Ensures in her a day. And then she was declining. So he when I visited that day, he said, well, I want to bring her into the hospital for IV fluids. She's getting dehydrated. Don't tell me you're going to let her die from dehydration. I mean, how many times do we hear that?
right.
And they were well up in years and that kind of thing. And I was like, well, I'm going to ask our doctor about that. But I said, I want to talk more about your wife and you. What's most important for me is that I hear who your wife was, how did she live her life, and tell me about your family and that kind of thing. As I said, in order for me to do my best work, I need to know who this person is, and I need to know what she would think in this situation.
Right.
So of course, he paused and he loved her so much he just couldn't hardly stop talking about her. And so then I said, so how long has it been since she's been able to walk? Or how long has it been since you heard her voice? How long has it been since you've been able to have a conversation? And you could just tell it moved his energy into a whole different place. And he's like, I would do anything to hear her voice again.
Mm.
And so then, kept saying, and I was like, we talked for, I don't know, 45 minutes. And I was like, well, I am going to follow through with your wish because that's most important. And I'll call the doctor and we'll talk about these IV fluids. But I said, I'd like to have permission. And again, I think we need to always ask permission, right? Is that I would like permission if I can ask you 2 questions to think about overnight, because I won't be able to get back to you today. Yep. And I said, they're going to be hard questions, very hard. Said, nope, probably what I need to hear, probably what I don't want to hear. I said, I hope you hear them in the spirit of compassion. The first question is, where do you see joy in your wife's life? Where do you see her enjoying life?
What do you say?
Long pause. He's like, wow, that really hurt.
Mm.
He said, I guess when you said you're going to ask hard questions, I guess you meant it. He said, okay, what's the second one? I said, when will it be okay for her to die? And he said, you know really how to hit a guy when he's down. And so I said, I asked those really in the spirit of compassion, because I hear your language of love. I always talk about the language of love and how that changes in life. It changes from babies to grade school kids to teenagers to in my life as a married couple. And I said, I think you're struggling with this language of love that you just shared, because I knew then all the examples he had told me about how they had been as a loving couple. So I said, I think you're struggling with the language of love. And what does love look like at this time? And I think if you quiet yourself tonight and reflect on those 2 questions, I think you will come up with the right answer, or your right answer, which would be love for your wife at this time. So he was like, those are very fair. He said, I probably should have been asked those questions a long time ago. And I said, I think questions just come at the right time for people. I said, you asked a question. You wanted us to move forward with IV fluids for hydration. I said, and therefore you gave me the opportunity to ask these questions to you. So I said, I'll do my work. I'll call you in the morning and we'll talk about your thoughts on those questions. So I said, I'll call probably 9 to 10, 8:15, he's calling me. And he said, Martha, I could hardly sleep last night. I stayed up thinking about those questions. And he just broke down crying. He said, I've been selfish way too long. He said, I've been afraid. We don't have any children. We don't have any family. I've been afraid of being alone. She hasn't had any joy in her life for years. I'm selfish. I've just kept keeping her alive for me. He said, I've decided I'm okay in letting her die. And he said it with so much peace and grace. And he was like, that was the best conversation. He said, you don't need to talk to that doctor. I don't want her to have any fluids. I just want her to be kept comfortable and for her to die peacefully. So, again, when I
But what
went
I
in that,
love about your story too is you didn't tell him what to think. You didn't tell him to call you in the morning and say these things.
no.
You said things that allowed him to swim in his own energy of it.
So when you mentioned that, I was like, no, how do I really do that? I never thought about it that way, Nate. I'm glad, again, we always learn from each other, but I like how you put that, is letting them just stay and swim in that emotion and that grief, but certainly giving them, a lifeboat, a raft in which to
Yeah.
save themselves. Yeah, I
Yeah,
like how you say that,
totally.
Nate. Yeah.
Because you had
So,
even a time when you were going to be reaching out. Like you gave him a time, but you also gave him a constructive period with goals. I mean, and did it all just because it's how we sometimes work within interactions, and that's when you're gonna have time to do it again, right?
yeah.
But your intentionality plays a part in that. Is that
Mhm.
fair?
Yeah, because that's why I pause and still today, even going into this patient I saw today, I pause and say, what is my intent here? Because it's
Mm,
easy to say, oh, I got to check on the pain, oh, I got to check on the breathing, oh, I got to check on delirium and that kind of thing. But when we do our real good work, when we're more present, is that we really think about what do I need to let everything go so that I can totally be present. And
mm,
when I thought about this patient that I was seeing, then I thought about what is the thing we really need to do? And the really thing that I felt we needed to do is see why this husband was making these decisions about, feeding him, pouring the insure down and things like that. Where was he really struggling, Nate, in his grief?
mm.
And that's where I think so many of our families get stuck in the corner out of that language of love. And what does love look, sound, and what decisions are love at this time in life? And it's not about dying, you see, it's about loving. And when we focus more on why our families might be struggling and where they are in that grief and what's driving that grief, if they let us in,
Yeah,
then we can really bring that wonderful holistic peace and a good death for
yeah.
that individual and
You,
that
yeah.
family.
You gave him the framework to see letting go of the feeding as an act of love, as
Yeah.
opposed to an act of contrition or neglect.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
why
exactly.
would why
Guilt.
would people
Guilt.
think about it otherwise if they haven't been
Yes.
given permission or been given that purview? Getting back to how we view movies and things, they've seen
Yep.
this movie a certain way, but we can show them a different way. They might not choose that way or like it, but it's all we
Yep.
can do. I
And when, isn't that so much though? Is that when we see families getting stuck, or we, even myself, I've gotten stuck, getting caught into trying to trying to get families to see it our way and trying to get families to agree with us and that kind of thing, versus just stepping back and just pausing to say, you know, where are they at in that grief and where are they really suffering?
hmm,
And
yeah,
and then be very intentional. Like for him, what I really
right,
saw is that where was this woman? And that's
right,
when I saw, when's the last time you heard her voice?
right,
When's the last time she had a conversation? What would she say in this
right.
situation? And reminding them of this individual and who they were, because I always think, Nate, I don't know about you, I'd be interested. What I like to tell families too is you often think that you're making this decision and you feel that terrible burden
Yeah.
in making these decisions. I remind you, this individual has probably told you the answer all their life. And if you were just to be quiet tonight and think about, go back to the conversations
Hmm.
when a friend died, an aunt died, an uncle died, grandma and grandpa's died. What was the conversation? Because you probably heard
Right.
this individual tell you the answer they want you to make now. Don't
Right.
feel alone. They're right
Right.
there with you.
Wow. I
Because isn't that neat?
yeah.
Don't you really think
No.
about that?
No.
My husband and kids, they don't need me to put it in writing. We've had so
Yeah.
many
No, I
dining
hear you.
room conversations. And so if we can pull them out of that grief and perhaps open up that grief a little bit more, that they can hear, oh yeah, that's right. They told me this. Oh yeah, we talked about that. But
Right.
if we leave them stuck and kind of boxed in that grief, then they can't hear those people's voices and they can't hear that, oh yeah, this is love. I know what to do.
We
We
give
give
people, your
people, your family,
families permission
permission
to
to
talk about
talk about.
mortality, to
Yeah.
accept the fact that we're gonna have to let go and allow them a freedom to do that how they have done it, their unique way as a family to do that, right? And I mean,
Yes.
they all do it differently.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot of similarities.
And they would do it differently than I do, and I have
Yeah,
to give them permission
totally.
because remember, I was just invited
Yeah,
to be a part of this time in their life.
right. I
Yeah.
want to invite you here. We probably got about 15 minutes or so. I'd like
Oh,
to invite you into an energy, and that is we're talking about high level communication stuff, right? It takes a lot of practice, a lot of years, a lot of doing it wrong, a lot of doing it right. And
right.
we also work in a profession that's just tired right now. It's been tough. 2020 is just, has it ended, right? And we've been working hard. We've always been busy. We will always be busy. And I'm talking about nursing in general, not just hospice and stuff. There's a lot. We're going through things. We've all been sick. We've all taken care of kids, loved ones, all these things. I feel like we have a profession that has its own pool of grief, our own energy of burnout and grief that shows up in things, all these sorts of things. I'm inviting you right now, come into that and help give us advice, this profession. How do we have these conversations while still swimming in our own difficulty of the existence of life?
Oh, Nate, you are just speaking so much to my heart. Um, if you only knew. I have such, I think I'll get emotional. Um, we have the greatest job in the world. Nurses
Yeah.
are the greatest people in the world. I have loved every day of being a nurse. I grieve. Yeah. Oh, better take a drink of water.
Yeah, me too.
Uh-huh. For so many years, you might have tough days and weeks because I worked, 30 years in ICU. And let me tell you, there were tough days. I've worked through nursing shortages and where, you were short and nobody got breaks. And in the CCU, what you would have 8 codes. You were just, because that was where before we have the stints that we have today. And there was so much sorrow and loss, but it was such a collective energy. And the team that I had the privilege of working with is that, that connectedness. So every day everybody showed up and you were in this space together where you were taking care of all these people. I worked with great, our nurse manager was there often with us. Our docs, our consultants were with us all day long, just embedded into taking care of the patients. The residents, we were working side by side. It was this whole collective team. And if you saw someone with a heavy load, you just went over and you just picked it up. I mean, it was just this movement and this energy that just existed within that whole team. Our docs knew our secretary's name, they knew our aide's name. It was just this dynamic team. So even when it got heavy and hard, we were always, the solid ground underneath ourselves. Um, and what I see that level of teamwork has shifted, and that makes me sad again. And for hospice, our team, and especially for the home team. Now I have to say, Nate, and I say it with great respect for our hospital team. When we had a hospice team, we had that energy because we were in a room, we went to see patient after patient together, we had dialogue, we had learning, and that real life learning about this patient shortness of breath versus this patient shortness of breath and the changes in medication. You were just bathed, and I do use that word a lot, bathed in teamwork and compassion, that we are all in it together. I see it in the hospital nursing units that energy, that sense of spirit is less. And I see it certainly in our home team, or I feel that in our home team. I think we have individual teams that are working very well and they're cohesive and they talk to each other and that kind of thing. But I don't feel the same energy that we invite everybody into our hard work. And I do think we need to, how can we do that better? I'm not sure. Um, I was reflecting on it in the last year about, and I think about this, and I have spoken to some people about it, is that how do we as a team, Nate, how do I serve you? And I intentionally use that word serve. How do I serve you on a day-to-day basis, Nate, so that you can be your very best for you seeing the patients that you see? How do I do that when I'm in a triage role? How do I do that when I'm in a resource role? How do I do it when I'm in the referral nurse? But how do I serve you that I take off what workload I can from you in order that you can be more present to every patient? That's what, when I work in those roles, Nate, that's what I think about. Just like I pause before I go into a patient home or a patient room, I pause today. And when I take a call, how can I serve that nurse? How can I serve that team? So Nate, I have no answer, but I can tell you my heart is heavy for our nursing profession.
I think you
We
do
have the greatest profession,
you
Nate.
have the answer, which is kind of an age-old one, which is keep serving and find the value and the gold that's in that. I mean, that's an ancient tale, right? I mean, in Christianity, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to offer his life as a sacrifice for many. You look at the Buddha, a rich man living this high life that gives up everything to become a servant.
The
Hinduism,
Franciscans.
right? Oh, the Franciscans.
The very sisters who started
Yes,
the hospital. It was all about
absolutely.
serving. And again, the docs that I worked with in the CCU, it was, where did I learn about being present with patients? From my first nurse manager, from my nursing instructors, from these consultants, where they would always go again. Before they did anything, they would go shake that patient's hand, and the docs would say, you can tell more about that patient by looking at their face and talking to them and greeting, holding their hand, than as much as a Swan Gans and a cardiac output and everything. So they taught me that. But then again, when I get bathed by the Franciscans, it's all about service, right?
Right?
That's what I learned growing up in my family. That's what
Yeah.
I learned for Franciscans. But Nate, how can where are we losing that within our nurses? Because when I'm at the hospital, I hear two
Yeah.
year nurses that have been only nursing 2 years, and they say, I'm burnt out of compassion,
I
Nate.
mean, that's a different talk that we should have at some
Okay,
point.
we could go
But
there next.
I think short answer, I think it's not just nursing. I think it's people that have just been working really hard in a society that's been working people really hard. I mean, they say the same thing about all first responders, right? You guys are all
Yeah,
heroes, which
yeah, yeah,
translated means very little reward for working really hard. And I think people are just tired, you know? And I think it's hard to be grieving and tired at the same time. It's just like it's hard for the body to heal until you get sleep and rest, right? But and
yeah.
that's why I love all the stuff you said. It was always about you have to find a place to center yourself, and that takes time and it takes silence. And there's no getting away from that.
And Nate, when you were charged, I would call you all the time after difficult. Do you remember that?
Sure.
Some days I'd be
Yeah.
crying. I was driving home from Plainview. Nate,
Yeah.
because the emotional burden and staying in those situations was I had to share that energy with someone. And
Yeah.
even today, when I was driving home from the hospital, I was thinking to myself, now who can I call? Because I just want to do something with this energy that I don't
Yeah.
keep carrying it and putting it in a shoebox and putting it on
Yeah.
the shelf, because that's when we become unhealthy.
Yeah. No, I 100%
So who
agree.
can I call? And you know what, Nate? I'm
Yeah.
going to tell you, I couldn't I couldn't think of who was the right person to call. So I kept it inside. I have to figure out what
Mhm.
I'm going to do with that energy today. Some days I don't need to, many days I don't.
Yeah.
Today was one of those patient situations where I needed to just share it, but I was like, oh, who do I call?
Well, you can always call me, Martha.
Maybe I still can. I still haven't seen that.
Absolutely, you still can.
But you know,
And
how does that
yeah,
sound to you, Nate? Do
I
you,
think
you're a male,
yeah, I
and
think
let's just talk about males different, they process things differently,
very different. No,
right?
I
Right?
think I'm a, one of the reasons I even did this and like just push record on a conversation is because I knew that we had got conversations and you just want to carry sword. And I was like, sweet, let's talk about something. And this is what I know you're good at. So I was like, let's talk about this. And these are the conversations we used to have in an office and people would just walk
Yeah.
into, and all of a sudden you have in a room that's talking about these things. And
Yes.
okay, the reality is we just don't even have that space for that to even happen anymore.
Yeah.
But what we do have are other tools that like the institution's giving us, like Microsoft Teams. What does it look like when we decide to utilize them and share it? I don't think it's the
Very cool.
same as having an in-person conversation, but this has been really nice. I
Yes.
have
It has
felt
been
your
fun.
energy, right? Like somehow
And yeah,
Microsoft Teams has catapulted our energy and we have had a
yeah,
connection, and we've had a
yeah,
really good conversation. And I think that is where most healing exists for everybody when it comes to grief. I'm not an expert. I'm not a bereavement expert. And it's a whole academic field that I'm very interested in, but I'm a student. And but it seems to me time and conversation is just a
yeah,
part of every process for people. Who you have those conversations with, very different, right? It's
yeah.
like that one individual that was very angry at you. You are not going to be that person. Probably.
The
I've seen crazier
conversation
things happen.
was silence.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But you still played a role, and I think that is a thing for all of us to take into part too, is that we all take roles. And one thing I've been thinking about today too is like Mother Teresa, one of her biographies, it says that for 10 years, and I've read it said other places too, for 10 years she did her work helping people die, and she didn't feel the way she put it was the touch of God. She
yes.
didn't feel any
Isn't that
good
humbling?
feelings for 10 years doing this
Yeah,
work. And I mean, I don't think it means suck it up if you're feeling burnt out and doing hospice work. No, I don't at all. I think if anything, she needed probably some more supports around her at that time. Holy cow. But it also makes me remember that it's okay to not always feel awesome. And it's okay to be honest about that. But to your point too, knowing who you can talk to, and if you really don't feel like you have someone you can talk to, that's not true. That at the end of the day, there's at least a program through HR, and I'm not making a commercial out of this, even though it feels like it, but EA, I don't even know what it is exactly, EOL or EA, something through HR, right? Like, so
Yeah,
there's a resource for people that if they really don't want to talk to anyone they know, they can talk to that. But people like you, people like me, we're willing to take calls, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And because see again, Nate, that goes back to how are we serving each other? And Nate, I wanted this. I worked hard trying to get it. And again, this is where nurses, see, I'm
Yeah.
calling again. I call upon us as a nursing profession because I wanted to, like, every 3 years, a nurse could get a paid month off, not they're just a regular PTO, but a
Yeah.
paid month off for self-healing. And again, I know everybody is going to be rolling their eyes, but I just
I'll take it.
one of my daughters is dating a young man in finance. Every 5 years, they get a 2 month sabbatical where they can just take off and it's all paid and it's not their PTO time.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, in finance, if they can do it, why can't we do it within our profession? And how much healing and when I look upon how we need nurses and that kind of thing, and how do we heal each other, and give that space. I think I have called some of our nurses up and I was like, can I see you had this heavy patient? I see you had that heavy patient. You need some time off. How are we giving that grace to when we know people are in a heavy situation, and not to bring up anything that might be misunderstood. Um, but if somebody's really been in a tense situation and a patient situation for a week, how can we give them time back, Nate? That they can be silent and just heal and come back feeling refreshed and supported. Is that possible?
I think those are really good questions, and I don't have any answers, right? And I think that sometimes we've tried to tackle them as a group in the past, and at times I think we've been successful. I think unit council, I think social committee, I feel like everybody does their part to like reach into that space.
Yeah.
But it's up to every group of people, just like us as a department, to have our relationships, form those relationships. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we're really busy crews that work a 24-hour together shift. So we stay busy. And if one's not working, it's easy to miss a picnic or something like that too. And it's just how it is. It's
And
we're, like
yeah.
Wall Street and all these jobs that so many other people have, it's just such a different grind. And I'm not saying they don't have their own grinds, but it's such a different grind than that 24/7 weekend model that a lot of us work, where we get it. But if you don't work that, you don't get it.
And it's that emotional, they might have intellectual, we have intellectual, emotional, um, and I think of us as a young group of individuals with young families. And again, and I've never changed my song and dance. I did this when I was single. I did it when we didn't have children. I've never changed my song and dance now. So Nate, when you talk about the invitation and you talk about the spirit and the well-being of our team, because I've never worked on, now, I know the COVID unit, they experienced a lot of this because of the same thing. The same thing we were looking with: grief, loss, sorrow, sudden changes in health, etc. But how do we as Mayo Hospice really set the standard for self-care?
Hmm.
And I know that there are counselors out there, but like you say, the staffing is tight. You don't want to let your colleagues down and say, boy, I really need, in order to be present, I need a day off. I just
Yes.
need a day off.
Right.
And that is welcomed with grace. No
Right.
questions, no questions,
Right.
but is welcomed with grace.
I think it at least brings up the point that it's important to be honest. And I've always felt from our managers that they want you to be honest with them, especially when it comes to your well-being, right?
Yeah.
I think that it's really hard to work in hospice department at all if you don't have like those basic like attunings to other people and their needs, right? It's like we have to take care of the living that are the caregivers here if we're going to keep doing our good work, for sure, 100%. But I
Yes.
appreciate you taking time to minister to my soul and to all those that will eventually watch this, assuming that I did it correctly and it's shareable.
It was,
Otherwise, we're going to
you
redo
know,
this whole thing. I'll need tears again at the 44-minute mark, and you're gonna have to be
okay.
just as sharp. I'm just kidding. No,
It
thank
was,
you,
you know
Martha.
what, Nate, thank you. And I saw what I say, it always starts with a conversation
Yes.
and then let the energy go.
You
Wherever it
bet.
takes you, starts with a conversation. Nate, let's do it again. Let's invite other people. This is